Hey guys, it's Libby, and today I would like to talk to you about the oft overlooked sibling of the Victorian novel, the Georgian novel. The Georgian era is a period of English history when 4 different guys named George were king, and it lasts from 1714 to 1830. Sometimes it gets extended to 1837 because there was one last king who was like the brother of the previous king, and his name wasn't George, it was William, but like no one wants to talk about the Wilhelmian period or something, which lasted for 7 years between the Georgian and the Victorian period. So sometimes we just say the Georgian period goes till 1837. And during this time period, you really get the birth of the English novel. There were some novels written in English before 1714, but it became really popular and widespread in the 18th century. And of course, the undisputed queen of the Georgian novel is Jane Austen. At least I assume. Does anybody want to dispute this? Bueller? Okay. So I'm actually not going to be talking about Jane Austen today because she has enough press. I'm going to be talking about all of the other Georgian novels that I have read. Now, the first thing you need to know about Georgian novels is that they're not very good. If you are a fan of Victorian novels, that is by no means an indication that you will be a fan of Georgian novels aside from the ones written by Jane Austen. So in this video, I'm going to give a brief review of all of the Georgian novels that I have read, and then at the end, give you a reading list of the ones I think are actually worth some of your time. But also, if you don't want to read any of these books, you can have a perfectly adequate reading life. If you go look at my Goodreads page, you may notice that I have rated some of these books 4 out of 5 stars. I think of that as a Georgian 4 stars, which is really a 3 stars in any other context. Most of these books are really not that great. The problems that they tend to suffer from is a lack of dynamic characters. I think that's one of the big innovations that Jane Austen really brought to English writing, is that her characters often change over the course of a novel. They do not in most other Georgian novels. People fit into an archetype and they just play out their archetype throughout the whole story without really having any growth or development. And because the characters don't really have any growth or development, the plot doesn't really have an arc or a feeling of progression. So in many instances, the novels feel episodic, and it kind of feels like you could put the chapters in any order and it would still be fine. I have put the novels that I have read into 4 categories, which are novels of the marriage game. This is also the category that I think Jane Austen's novels would go in. Gothic novels, political novels, and then other. So starting off with those novels of the marriage game, I'd first like to talk about The Female Quixote by Charlotte Lennox. This is one of the earlier Georgian novels that I've read, published in 1752. I mostly focused on 1770 and later because the ones from before 1770 are like even worse. So there will be alas, no Phantomina in this video. Anyway, The Female Quixote. The title is referring to Don Quixote by Cervantes, which is the story of a man who is got a little bit senile and either thinks or sort of wishes he was a chivalric knight, a knight in a medieval romance. So The Female Quixote is about a young woman who has lived a fairly reclusive life, and has spent her childhood and adolescence reading these romantic medieval novels, capital R romantic medieval novels, and she really wants to be the heroine in one of these medieval novels. And the entire story, after we get the first chapter introducing us to our premise, is basically scenes where she does something silly because she thinks she's a medieval heroine. This is kind of charming and entertaining for the first 1 or 2, but it gets really dull really fast. It doesn't help that, guys, a lot of medieval literature is also bad. So, like a pastiche of bad literature in another type of bad literature. For the record, I think it's totally valid to just read a couple of chapters of these books to get the gist and then bail once they start to get too repetitive. These works are all in the public domain, so you can get them for free on Kindle or find them on Project Gutenberg. Then we've got Evelina by Frances Burney. This was published in 1778. And Jane Austen does make reference to Frances Burney in her letters, although I think not in her novels, and she seems to think that Frances Burney was pretty okay. Frances Burney has wrote 4 main marriage game novels. Evelina is by far the shortest, and so that is the one that I decided to read. And it is what I think of as the marriage game novel, which is where you have a young heroine, normally late teens, who has lived a very sort of Rousseauian idyll of a childhood, very separate from society. She's got this sort of pure existence out in the countryside, and then she goes to the big city and is scandalized, shocked, or can't really blend in with all these city goers, and she sort of shows them up with her virtue and eventually, marries a nice man. And I just realized that in describing the archetypical, which one is correct? Marriage game novel, I have fully described the plot of Evelina. Heroine's Evelina. She lives in the country. Then she goes to London, hangs out with some people she's not used to, is rude at some point, but it all works out. Next we've got Belinda by Maria Edgeworth, which was published in 1801. Maria Edgeworth was Anglo-Irish, so she is of English heritage, but was living in Ireland for most of her life. In Belinda, you got your classic marriage game story going on with the main character of Belinda, but this book is most notable for its subplot, which is cut in later editions. So if you do read Belinda, I would recommend finding the earliest version of the text that you can before it was edited and revised, because in a subplot, there is an interracial romance. So a servant girl and a man from the Caribbean, who I believe had formerly been enslaved, fall in love and get married. After publication, this was deemed to be too controversial, and so instead of falling in love, they're just friends. The portrayal of the black man, even though it is attempting to be positive, is still pretty uncomfortable to read. Then we've got A Simple Story by Elizabeth Inchbald, which is let's see. I think Elizabeth Inchbald and Jane Austen both realized the same thing. This was published in 1791. They both realized that these marriage game novels, they're pretty silly. So Jane Austen attempted to reform them and make them better, and Elizabeth Inchbald was like, I'm just going to write the silliest goddamn thing. So I kind of love A Simple Story, although it is admittedly bad. It's extremely sentimental. Sentiment was very attractive quality to your character in the late 18th century, and this is what Jane Austen makes fun of in Sense and Sensibility. So if you are highly sensible, that means you are very affected by your emotions. So in basically every chapter of A Simple Story, a character ends up collapsed on the floor in tears. You get some more of those sort of medievally tropes. There is an abduction, oh my god. This starts out as a romance between a young lady named Miss Milner, no first name, we never learn her first name, and she falls in love with a guardian who is a Catholic priest. Oops! Those guys can't get married. It's basically about will they, won't they? Then we're gonna move on to the Gothic novels, which are novels that get parodied, referenced at least, in Northanger Abbey. So what is identified as the first Gothic novel is The Castle of Otranto by Horace Walpole, which was published in 1764. Gothic novels tend to be set outside of England, often in a Catholic country like Italy, Spain, or France. They tend to be set in the historical period, in a historical period from the perspective of the writers, so medieval or 16th or 17th century. Sometimes there is some spookiness going on with ghosts or vampires, but sometimes everything's fairly natural, but you just have really bad people. Sometimes the monster is man. And that is mostly the case in the Castle of Otranto. There are some kind of supernaturally things that happen in there, but for the most part, it's about a lord who, his son was about to get married, but then his son gets crushed by some falling ceiling, or maybe a statue falls on him or something like that. So the bride is still there, and the lord, although he is already married, wants to marry this young lady. He gives some sort of justification, but it's because she's hot. And so it's all about her running around trying to get away from him. It's not good. Then we've got the Mysteries of Udolpho, which is one of the most referenced books in Northanger Abbey. Catherine Morland is reading it and is incredibly fascinated by it. I only got about 75 pages into this because I was bored to pieces. It's about a nice young lady in an idyllic countryside. Presumably some things are gonna go bad. I was bored to tears. I couldn't. Oh, Mysteries of Udolpho was published in 1794. So now I'm going to talk about Caleb Williams by William Godwin, which was also published in 1794. Caleb Williams is much less supernatural and is a bit more of a thriller. It's about a young man, Caleb, who gets employed as like a secretary for local bigwig Squire Falkland. While he is going through the squire's papers, it kind of seems like maybe the squire has committed a murder. And when the squire finds out that Caleb knows about this, Caleb is in big trouble and has to go on the run. And it then turns into the closest thing I think of is the 199 Steps. Caleb's like running around on moors, trying to hide, trying to disguise himself, falling in with all sorts of the wrong kinds of people. Entertaining and also, you know, a bit of philosophical interest because Caleb thinks that now Squire Falkland is a pretty good guy, but he did this murder in the past. Should I reveal it? Next Gothic novel is probably the other Georgian novel that you've heard of that's not by Jane Austen, which is Frankenstein by Mary Shelley, published in 1818. This is reading it. Let's see. The public perception of the novel Frankenstein is quite different from the actual novel Frankenstein. The first thing that most people run into is that it is an epistolary novel, so we start off with like 30 pages by a character who's not involved in the story, and he's like, I found this weird guy, and he's just writing letters to his sisters on a boat, and then eventually we get into the story of Victor Frankenstein and his monstrous creation. Two other things about Frankenstein that our public consciousness doesn't really portray. One, Victor Frankenstein is extremely young. I think the cultural image of Victor Frankenstein is a man in his like 50s or 60s. Frankenstein is a college student. He's 20. Which gives me a bit more sympathy for him because he's like, oops, I have no idea what to do. How am I supposed to be a parent? I'm still a child. Shout out to all my 20-year-olds who are watching this. I don't think you're children. Victor Frankenstein's a bit of a child. And also, it's extremely sentimental. Everyone's feeling their emotions so goddamn hard. The main emotion that they feel is horror and disgust, so hope you're into that. And next we've got the Private Memoirs and Confessions of a Justified Sinner by James Hogg, published in 1824. This one is not set in some continental country, but is set in Scotland, and so instead of a Catholic country, we have an extremely Puritan country. So this one is quite supernatural. We have Satan a little bit shows up, and we have this very religious guy. What's his name? I don't remember the names of any of the main characters. Nope, okay, it doesn't tell me on the first page of Goodreads, it doesn't matter. So we have this guy who's trying to be a good guy. He believes in Calvinism, and so person who, as it may so happen, is Lucifer, tells him like, hey, you're a good guy, you must be predestined for heaven, which means that it doesn't matter what you do, God has already decided where you're gonna go, so you don't have to do any of the good things. You're going to heaven no matter what, so you can do bad things. And the guy's like, oh man, I'm gonna go do some bad things. Very fun. Now moving on to the political novels. So two more books by Maria Edgeworth, who also wrote Belinda. So the first one is Castle Rackrent, and here she is kind of making fun of her own class, so that's the Anglo-Irish landlords. Castle Rackrent is told from the perspective of Fatty Quirk, great name, who is an upper servant or possibly even a steward at Castle Rackrent. And again, not really a plot. He just sort of talks about the four different men who are the like lords, I don't think they're actually lords, but the owners, the landlords of Castle Rackrent during his tenure, and how mostly they're pretty bad. They're bad people and bad landlords. Castle Rackrent was published in 1800. Then we've got Harrington, which was published in 1817, also by Maria Edgeworth. And this book is mainly about like, hey, maybe the Jews aren't so bad. So Harrington is our main character. He is not Jewish, but he is just, the novel is sort of his interactions with Jewish people and how like most people are terrible to them, and how it's like they're actually just normal people, guys. This is another like, I didn't finish this one either. This is another very episodic novel where if you've read 3 chapters, you've read them all. And also like, good on Maria Edgeworth for saying like, let's not be anti-Semitic, but it's still really unpleasant to read about a bunch of anti-Semitism. Then moving on to some of the more feminist ones. First we've got Adeline Mowbray by Amelia Opie, which is loosely based on the life of William Godwin, author of Caleb Williams, and Mary Wollstonecraft, author of some novels I'm about to mention, both of them parents of Mary Shelley, author of Frankenstein. This is one of those classic Georgian novels with a great premise, poor execution. So Adeline Mowbray is about a couple living together out of wedlock. Our couple of Adeline Mowbray and Frederick Glenn Murray think that love is more important than marriage, and as long as you have love, that's all the justification that 2 people need to live together. They don't need to be married, and they want to flout society, and they do flout society, but society kind of flouts them right back. This is one of those novels where it's very episodic, and you can kind of put the chapters in any order. It's also extremely miserable, because as you can imagine, Adeline has a pretty tough time. Next, 2 very short novels by Mary Wollstonecraft. They are Mary, a Fiction, and Maria, or the Wrongs of Woman, which was maybe unfinished? I can't remember. It's certainly very short. These, again, are books with an interesting premise, but are mostly just not very well written stories of women being extremely miserable. And so I do not recommend them. Okay, then rounding out with the misfits that I couldn't get into any other category, we got one of the most famous novels of the Georgian era, at least to the Georgians, Pamela by Samuel Richardson, published in 1740. This is sometimes identified as the first English novel. Oh my god, it's wretched. Okay, first off, it's an epistolary novel, so it's all a bunch of letters written by our heroine Pamela to her parents, most of which are not being sent. Because Pamela is a servant who's being majorly creeped on by her new master after her former mistress dies. This is a book that I rated 1 star. I rate very few books 1 star. I really don't think there's anything redeeming about this. It's too long, both, as you're going along, and then at the end, the last like 100 pages doesn't have anything to do with the previous plot. We just introduce a whole new situation that we have to deal with. But the real problem is that Pamela's master keeps trying to sleep with her, including at one point sexually assaulting her. At the end, Pamela says, "Oh, I've loved you the whole time and would happily marry you. I just wasn't gonna have sex with you out of marriage." And I'm like, Samuel Richardson, that's not how it do. Really, guys, spare yourselves. Don't read Pamela. And last one is Nature and Art by Elizabeth Inchbald, who also wrote a simple story. I had very high hopes for Nature and Art. It is incredibly boring. Just read a simple story twice. So those are all the Georgian novels, aside from the ones by Jane Austen, that I have actually read. Which ones do I recommend? So I would say, from the marriage game category, pick one out of Female Quixote, Evelina, or Belinda. Whichever one seems the most interesting to you, just read that one. Then you know what that genre is about. You can move on to other and better books. You do have to read A Simple Story. A Simple Story is stupid and great. And Elizabeth Inchbald, I'm pretty sure, knew it was stupid, which is part of what makes it great. Then I recommend reading 3 of the Gothic novels, Caleb Williams, Frankenstein, and Confessions of a Justified Sinner. I think are all worth a bit of your time. And then I do not recommend any of the political novels or miscellaneous ones. So I'm giving you a 5-book reading list, 3 Gothic, 2 Marriage Games. And then you can, with confidence, return to Jane Austen and really appreciate her and her dynamic characters. Thank you for listening to me shit on a bunch of books. I'll see you later.